Charlie Ferguson sat on the bench on that late August day in 1885, he must have had butterflies in his stomach. He had turned in a remarkable pitching performance for the Philadelphia Quakers, which is what the Phillies were known as back then, having gone 9 innings without giving up a single hit. But now was the bottom of the 9th inning, and the Quakers' offense was as anemic as their opponents, the Providence Grays. Would the Quakers be successful in generating some offense and completing the no-hitter that day? All Charlie Ferguson could do was to wait and be ready to pitch the 10th inning.
Philadelphia Baseball History presents the first Phillies superstar, Charlie Ferguson.
The Quakers' opponents that day were the Providence Grays. They were the reigning National League champions. And on that day, August 29, 1885, the Grays stood in 3rd place, right in front of the Quakers. The Quakers were fighting to have their first regular season that did not end in a losing record, and they would have to beat the reigning champs in order to do it. Now, the year before, the Providence Grays were involved with what some called the first World Series. Back then, there were 2 major leagues. There was the National League that, of course, exists today, and there was the American Association. The American Association was also known as the Beer and Whiskey League because, unlike the National League, American Association teams could sell alcoholic beverages at their ballparks. In fact, a number of American Association teams were owned by distilleries. In 1884, the American Association pennant went to the New York Metropolitans. The Metropolitans manager, Jim Moutrie, issued a challenge to the manager of the Providence Grays, Frank Bancroft. The Grays, of course, won the pennant for the National League. If both teams put up $1,000, then the winner would take all the money and declare themselves the champion of professional baseball. Seeing the opportunity to attract a number of paying fans to see the series, the Providence Grays agreed. And so the Metropolitans would face the Grays in a 3-game series that would be played under American Association rules and at the New York Polo Grounds. The first game was played on October 23, 1884, and the Grays won 6-0. Game 2 was played on the next day. After 7 innings, the Grays were ahead 3-1, but the game was called on account of darkness. Because back then, games usually started around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so games in the fall had a very limited time in order to be complete. But if a game went at least 5 innings, we would call that a regulation game or an official game. Well, then the game could end, and the team that was ahead at the last completed inning would be declared the winners of the game. And so the Grays won the second game of a 3-game series. In fact, they had taken the series and now were the baseball champions. But the 2 teams decided to play a 3rd game to see if they could attract more fans. That day was bitterly cold. Only 300 fans showed up to watch the game, and it was called in the 6th inning because of the weather. The Grays were ahead 6-0 and therefore were declared the winner of the 3rd game. So the press varied in how they described the winner of this series. The New York Clipper, for example, described the Grays as the champions of the United States. But the Sporting Life, adding a bit of pizzazz and hyperbole, called the Grays the world champions. And that name stuck. After that season, the 2 leagues decided that they were going to continue with the series and call it the World Series. And that first primitive World Series went on between the American Association and the National League until the American Association folded after the 1891 season. But getting back to August 29, 1885, Charlie Ferguson had to face the reigning champs and beat them if the Phillies had any hope of having a winning season. And he showed that he was more than up to the task. He was born to an Irish family and lived in an Irish neighborhood called Random Row. Now, there's no evidence that he ever enrolled in the University of Virginia. However, there are some sources that say that in 1882, he played for the University of Virginia team. Now, one explanation is that he may not have played for the official University of Virginia team as we think of it today. Rather, at the time, many employers, be they banks, newspapers, or even factories, put together baseball teams for their employees' leisure time. It's more likely that Charlie Ferguson played for a team like this that was associated with the University of Virginia. At any rate, while playing in 1882, Charlie Ferguson caught the eye of a merchant from Richmond. That merchant convinced Charlie to join his team in 1883, and while playing for Richmond is when he was discovered by the Quakers. Al Reach, the co-owner of the Quakers, offered Ferguson a $1,500 contract to play baseball the next season. And so Charlie Ferguson made his major league debut on May 1st, 1884. It was a rout of the Detroit Wolverines. The Quakers won 13-2, and Ferguson contributed to the offensive onslaught with a triple and 2 singles. So by the time we reached late August of 1885, the National League was in its 10th season. 19 other pitchers had accomplished a no-hitter in the major leagues up to that point, but nobody had done it for the Philadelphia Quakers. Now, there had been 2 no-hitters thrown by professional teams based out of Philadelphia. The first was in 1875. It was thrown by Joe Borden of the Philadelphia White Stockings in what was the final season of the very first professional league, the National Association. And then the year before, in 1884, Al Atkinson of the Philadelphia Athletics pitched a no-hitter in the American Association. But for the team that we now know as the Phillies, no pitcher had yet accomplished that feat. In fact, Charlie Ferguson went on to be the first superstar in Philadelphia Phillies history. In 1884, for example, Ferguson won over 20 games. The fact is, the Quakers were dismal. They had climbed out of last place under the leadership of Harry Wright as the new manager, but only to 6th place, with a record of 39 wins and 73 losses. Ferguson won over 20 games that year, but he still had a losing record. He won 21 games against 25 losses. One bright spot for the Quakers season was that Ferguson's ERA was 3.54, and 1884 was Charlie Ferguson's only losing season. In 1885, 1886, and 1887, Ferguson won more than 20 games each season. He topped out at 30 wins in 1886. Over those 4 seasons, Charlie Ferguson had a record of 99 wins to 64 losses and an ERA of 2.67. Moreover, twice he had pitched over 400 innings in a single season. Charlie Ferguson was a pitching workhorse. But not only that, Ferguson could swing the bat. Now in 1884, he only hit .246, but he hit in 52 games. 2 of those games, he played the outfield instead of pitching. In 1886, he brought his average up to .306, and that year, he played in the outfield for 13 games. And in 1887, despite the fact that he was not an everyday player, he still led the Quakers in RBIs with 85. In fact, Harry Wright recognized that it was more valuable for the Quakers to have Ferguson in the lineup every day than to have him pitch. So towards the end of the season, he was making Ferguson the everyday second baseman. In 72 games that year, he batted .335. So after the Quakers rose to second place in 1887, Harry Wright set his mind on making a pennant run in 1888 with Charlie Ferguson as his everyday second baseman. But all of that physical activity was taking a toll on Charlie's body. He already had a reputation of being somewhat of a hypochondriac, and that's because he would carry a medical case with him when the Quakers went on road trips. In 1886, that was Charlie's best year as a pitcher. He posted a 1.98 ERA with 30 wins. That year, he even became the first major league pitcher to win 2 games on the same day. But by August, Charlie was feeling weak. He was sent home to Virginia where he recovered from his illness. He rejoined the team as they were starting a road trip that began in Chicago. Now, it may have been the extended heat wave. It may have been the water. But Charlie began feeling sick again. So he asked the manager, Harry Wright, if he could return to Charlottesville so he could get proper treatment. Harry Wright said no. Charlie thought that his manager just didn't understand the full extent of his problem. So he was left with a difficult situation. He opted to disobey his manager and catch a train from Chicago back to Virginia. There, Charlie spent 10 days in bed recovering. He rejoined the team in Philadelphia, and he had a doctor's note in hand to excuse his absence from the team. But Harry Wright thought that his errant pitcher needed some discipline. So Wright suspended Ferguson and fined him $200. And that's $200 from a salary of $1,800. In fact, none of the Quakers were reaching the league's cap on salary of $2,000. Co-owner and treasurer, Colonel John Rogers, well, he had a reputation of being stingy, and that's something that would cost the Phillies in the early 20th century. That's when all of the Phillies stars jumped leagues to go and play for the upstart American League. As for Ferguson, he was an early member of the Brotherhood of Professional Baseball Players, an organization that was started by New York pitcher John Montgomery Ward. It was a forerunner to a baseball players' union. It was formed in part to the reserve clause. The reserve clause robbed the players of their ability to market their skills and talent to any team in the league. Instead, they remained tied to the team they played for the previous season. In 1887, Charlie thought that he deserved a raise. So when Harry Wright asked Charlie to join the Quakers when they went down south for spring training, Ferguson said, "No, I want you to pay me $3,000. Well, the Quakers refused. But Ferguson coached baseball for the Princeton University team, so he held out for more money. Eventually, Harry Wright offered him $2,500. At first, Ferguson refused, but he eventually came around, and he was all set to begin the 1887 season with the Quakers. But that season presented a personal tragedy for Charlie and his wife Mary. In June of that year, they lost their infant daughter. Charlie dealt with his grief by throwing himself into playing baseball, and at one point, he set the Phillies' record for most consecutive wins by a pitcher, with 12. It was a record that stood well into the modern era, and was only broken by Steve Carlton's magical season of 1972. Carlton won 15 games in a row. Charlie finished the season with a record of 22 wins to 11 losses. And as I stated, he led the Quakers in RBIs with 85. But once again, Charlie was exhausted by the end of the season. In 1888, Charlie once again held out and coached for Princeton. He didn't sign with the Quakers until early April of that year. But when he played an exhibition game against the American Association Athletics, he didn't look so good. By mid-April, he had a fever, and then he developed spots on his chest. Quakers owner Al Reach brought in the best of doctors in order to treat Charlie. He had been diagnosed with typhoid. Charlie didn't begin the regular season with the Quakers. Instead, he was confined to his residence in North Philly for several weeks. On April 29th, his teammates came to visit him after they had just dropped a game to New York. One teammate is said to have said to Charlie, "We certainly are having bad luck this year." Charlie asked to talk to Sid Farrar, the team's first baseman. As Sid came close, Charlie said to him, "Sid, I am afraid that I am going to die." Charlie then went unconscious. His teammates brought his wife Mary up, but she was so upset, which is understandable, she didn't want to go into the room. When she did go into the room, Charlie was pronounced dead. Mary screamed in grief and then fainted. The 25-year-old star athlete had succumbed to typhoid. So we turn back the clock to August 29th, 1885, and Charlie Ferguson's performance had been impressive. He struck out 8 batters. One batter was called out on a caught foul tip. That's a play that we would call a strikeout today. 7 batters were retired with short infield fly balls. In fact, the only blot on Ferguson's pitching performance was the fact that he gave up 2 walks in the 4th inning, and an error had led to a bases-loaded situation. Nonetheless, Charlie was able to pitch out of trouble. But even with Charlie's remarkable pitching performance, the game remained scoreless. Charlie Ferguson, sitting on the bench, watched as his teammates came up to the plate in the bottom of the 9th in Philadelphia's Recreation Park. Mulvey, the Quakers' third baseman, got the offense going with a single. He then stole second. He moved over to third when outfielder Jim Fogarty grounded out. Would this be it? Would the Quakers reward Ferguson with the team's first ever no-hitter? With the pressure on, the Grays pitcher threw a wild pitch, and Mulvey came charging in from third. He scored, and Philadelphia won 1-0. In fact, this is still the smallest of margins that the Phillies have ever won a no-hitter by. And Charlie Ferguson became indelibly written into the history books of Philadelphia baseball. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.
If you have any ideas for topics that we can cover in the future, please let us know in the comments below. You can find a design for the t-shirt used in today's video in our merch store. We also have new designs based on Charlie Ferguson and the Philadelphia Quakers. And don't forget to show your pride as you protect your health and that of your family. We'll have a link in the description box. If you would like to see more of these videos, please consider becoming a patron through Patreon. Again, we'll have a link in the description box below.